If you ask anyone you know who is a fan of horror games, or even games in general, to name their top 10 scariest monsters, it's almost certain that the Regenerator will be on that list, and most likely ranked very high. The Resident Evil series is full of terrifying creatures, but few have left as much of a lasting impact as this abomination. Despite Resident Evil 4 leaning more into action than previous games, the Regenerator was notorious for scaring almost everyone. And if you think about it, the Regenerator looked very different from other bioweapons in the series. Its appearance and unnatural movements were terrifying enough, but what made it even worse was how eerily plain its body was. Unlike other B.O.Ws with claws, exposed muscle, or grotesque mutations, the Regenerator was just a grey lifeless husk, lacking any defining features, except for its unnervingly wide, tooth-filled grin. That emptiness, combined with its inhuman biology, made it far more disturbing than almost any other monster Umbrella had ever created. And beyond that, there were ethical concerns. What would happen if the Regenerator project didn't go according to plan? Or more scary, did they even have a plan? So, what exactly made it so different compared to all the other monsters we've seen? The Regenerator's design went through many changes during the game's early development. In earlier versions of Resident Evil 4, such as the Fog version and the Hookman version, Leon faced more supernatural threats rather than the biological experiments gone wrong that defined the final game. To match that eerie, ghostly atmosphere, the Regenerator originally had a very different form. At one point, it was known as the Lurching Man, a creature that could shapeshift and morph its body. This design leaned more into psychological horror, making it feel less like a failed experiment and more like an unnatural shifting entity. However, due to technical limitations and a shift towards a more grounded horror approach, the concept was scrapped. Instead, the Regenerator slowly evolved into the version we know today, though remnants of its original design still remain. Its elongated limbs, unsettling grin, and slow unnatural movements can all be traced back to its earlier scrapped forms. In the final version of the game, the Regenerator became a more grounded, scientifically explainable creature, fitting alongside other bioweapons in the Resident Evil universe. But what truly set it apart was how radically different its biology was from any other B.O.W. created before it. At first glance, its abilities seem almost random. Instant regeneration, the ability to stretch its limbs to unnatural lengths, an erratic movement pattern where it could walk, run, lunge, or even slither, and its explosive death when pushed beyond its limits. These creatures weren't created in a high-tech Umbrella lab, but in a makeshift research facility on the island, where Sadler's researchers experimented through brutal trial and error. The test subjects were people who resisted the cult, captives deemed wasted potential, and subjected to painful experimentation. Their bodies were forcefully implanted with multiple plagas, which completely rewrote their biology, turning them into something unrecognizable. The multiple plagas allowed each part of the Regenerator's body to act sort of independently. Unlike humans or even zombies, it didn't really have a central nervous system or a conventional brain. Instead, the plagas became an artificial nervous system, puppeteering the body and essentially turning it into a moving corpse. This is why its movements were so freakishly erratic and unpredictable. The parasites weren't guiding the body with coordinated control, but rather in a primitive vestigial way, as if it was being forced to move despite having no natural function left. But the most terrifying trait of this abomination was just how fast and accurately it could regenerate from damage. It was far more efficient and stable than nearly any bioweapon Umbrella had ever created. The multiple plagas inside its body could dramatically accelerate its metabolism, providing the massive amounts of energy needed to regrow tissue almost instantly. However, this came at a cost. This process required far more oxygen, which is why Regenerators constantly wheezed and gasped for air, giving them that creepy breathing sound. Their bodies were in a perpetual state of regeneration, which constantly needed fuel to maintain their form. But Oxygen alone wasn't enough. Their regeneration demanded an endless supply of biomass, requiring them to consume huge quantities of food. Because of this, regenerators were constantly overfed, so their bodies could store excess mass to sustain their rapid healing. This endless demand for resources may have even contributed to the famine that plagued the village at the time. Even their skeletal structure was radically altered. Their bones were no longer rigid or fully intact, meaning they could have been potentially fractured or even completely separated in some places. This lack of structural integrity allowed for unnatural flexibility, which is why they could extend their arms so far out and slither across the ground effortlessly. But this enhanced biology came with a fatal flaw. If all the plagas inside the body were destroyed, its accelerated metabolism would spiral out of control, leading to a massive buildup of heat that caused the body to explode. But sometimes, when a regenerator's body sustained too much damage, it could evolve into a second form, a last-ditch survival mechanism known as the Iron Maiden. In this form, a single plaga would take control, residing in the head, while the body underwent a gruesome transformation. Sharp spikes tore through its skin, turning the creature into a walking death trap, and they could extend these spikes at will, making the Iron Maiden even more dangerous in both offense and defense. This mutation didn't just make it harder to kill, it also changed how it behaved. The Iron Maiden became more aggressive, attacking anything that became a threat to its survival. This suggests that given enough time and exposure to the plagas, or further experimentation, regenerators could have mutated even further. Sadler and his research team knew this, and they planned to refine them into something even more advanced. If you compare regenerators to Umbrella's past bioweapons, or even creatures created with LasPlagas itself, they stand out a lot, both physically and behaviorally. The Plaga parasite had the ability to mutate organisms into all kinds of monstrous forms, often granting them incredible abilities at the cost of their free will. Almost every Plaga-based creature had defining traits that made them distinct. For example, the Verdugo, the U3, and the Novistadors were all created by combining Plaga mutations with arthropod DNA, resulting in creatures with exoskeletons, enhanced agility, or flight. Meanwhile, humans directly infected by the parasite, such as Ganados, retained a degree of intelligence, while special mutations like Dr. Salvador or the Garrador gained enhanced strength and physical adaptations. Even Umbrella's virus-based experiments, both successful and failed, followed a clear pattern of mutations that gave each monster unique biological features. But regenerators were completely different. They didn't really have any distinct mutations, no visible signs of evolution, just grey lifeless husks that looked eerily human, with the only oversized difference being their oversized mandible filled with unnatural teeth. Unlike other B.O.Ws which displayed some level of animalistic instinct, aggression, curiosity, or even predatory behavior, regenerators showed none of that. They didn't act like a living organism, they just existed, moving with no real expression, purpose, or even self-preservation, making them far more unsettling than any other mutation. The experiments conducted on the island were mostly makeshift and underfunded, with researchers and engineers scraping together whatever resources they could find to keep their work going. The regenerators were one of the most extreme results of these experiments. Unlike other LasPlagas mutations which relied on the parasite naturally integrating with the host, the regenerators were among the first plaga-based bioweapons that involved direct scientific intervention. They were basically one of the first artificially engineered plaga experiments, which explains why they look so different from previous bioweapons. The biggest issue with this project was that it was far ahead of its time, at least relative to the limited resources available on the island. Unlike Umbrella's viral bioweapons, which were created in state-of-the-art laboratories using artificial viruses, the regenerators were built from something organic, a living parasite, and modified using human experimentation. This experiment revealed a darker side to the LasPlagas' potential, showing just how far it could be pushed through scientific manipulation. But even with multiple plagas inside them, regenerators didn't develop the excessive mutations seen in other plaga creatures. even dominant Plaga samples like Mendez, Salazar, or even Krauser. This was likely because their design and function was completely different. Most Plaga-based creatures gained claws, exoskeletons, or extra limbs due to their parasite fusing with their nervous system and pushing their biology in a new direction. But Regenerators, however, were built with a different priority: endurance over mutation. Instead of warping their bodies outward, the Plagas inside a Regenerator acted as an internal control mechanism, overriding the body's natural function and keeping it in a stable humanoid form. Their mutations were happening inside, hidden beneath their skin, which is why they look so disturbingly plain. Their grey, featureless bodies and unsettlingly wide mouths made them feel inhuman, but in a way that didn't rely on exaggerated monstrous traits. Another major reason for their unnatural appearance could have very well been their hyperactive metabolism, which constantly broke down and rebuilt their tissue. This meant that any large mutations like extra body parts or bony armor plating would have been erased as the regeneration process restored them to their original form. The results were undeniable. The Regenerator's ability to heal was far more precise, stable, and efficient than anything Umbrella had ever created. Developing the Regenerator wasn't just difficult, it was an ethical and logistical nightmare. The island facilities were severely underfunded, and the researchers had limited resources to contain their experiments. Because Regenerators had an extremely fast metabolism, they couldn't be kept in normal containment units. They would burn through too much energy, requiring constant feeding just to stay alive. This forced researchers to store them in cryogenic stasis tanks, only thawing them out when needed for combat. These frozen chambers, along with the body bags scattered across the island, were a grim reminder of just how unstable these creatures were. They were completely unpredictable and uncontrollable. If anything went wrong, they could easily break free and kill anyone nearby. The facility's outdated power grid made things even worse. The freezers and lab equipment required enormous amounts of energy, which the island's failing generators struggled to provide. Power had to be constantly rerouted, meaning that any system failure could lead to disaster, and eventually it did. During one critical power outage, a regenerator broke loose, killing 7 engineers and severely wounding 19 others. They recovered all the bodies except one. One of the missing engineers had a wrench in his possession, the same one later found inside the stomach of a regenerator, strongly suggesting that it ate him whole. But while the engineers feared the creatures, not all of the researchers shared their concerns. Some of them knew exactly what they were creating and did it willingly. Or did they? One of Sadler's chief researchers, Annabel Garcia Escudero, once praised herself for creating the regenerators, but according to a colleague's final notes, she wasn't always like this. At some point, she and several others were imprisoned, and when she returned from a mysterious meeting with Sadler, she was never the same again. She became fanatical, fully devoted to the project, almost as if something inside her had changed. It's likely that she was infected with the Plaga, not in a way that transformed her physically, but in a way that broke her mind, forcing her to embrace the horror she helped create. Either it was Sadler's influence that made her continue with this experiment, or maybe an even darker possibility. If she was truly under the control of the Plaga, then essentially the Plaga created a near-perfect humanoid version of itself, the physical embodiment of LasPlagas itself. But not all researchers were like this. Some realized the true danger of these experiments before it was too late. One of them was Luis Serra. Once he saw what was being engineered and how it defied the natural order of life, he abandoned his research and turned against LasPlagas entirely. He was one of the few who understood the real implications of what Sadler was creating, and he worked to ensure his knowledge wouldn't bring harm to the world. Luis followed a very well-known warning. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. But his insight didn't come from just working on LasPlagas. Before this, he had been involved in the Umbrella's Nemesis project, which experimented with a synthetic version of the Plaga called the NE-alpha parasite. Unlike the natural Plaga, this variant was artificially modified to act as a controllable parasite within Umbrella's B.O.Ws. Luis knew exactly what Umbrella was capable of. and he understood that once Sadler began experimenting with LasPlagas, the result could be even worse than anything Umbrella had created. There was one monster in Umbrella's past experiments that came close to the Regenerators' resilience. Lisa Trevor. Lisa could withstand extreme amounts of damage, but even she couldn't heal herself as fast as the Regenerator. Umbrella attempted to implant the NE-alpha parasite into her, hoping it would enhance her abilities, but her body rejected and destroyed it. This raises an interesting question. What if Lisa had been implanted with LasPlagas instead? Could she have become something even more horrifying? And would her body even be able to destroy this parasite? Other bioweapons such as Tyrants also had limited regeneration, but their mutations were ultimately unstable. The first form of Nemesis was arguably its most lethal, while later forms became increasingly uncontrollable. The G-Virus, despite its regenerative properties, also spiraled out of control, mutating into something impossible to weaponize long-term. But unlike those experiments, Regenerators were created under makeshift conditions and minimal resources, and yet they still managed to be stable, efficient, and mass-producible. This makes you wonder, if Umbrella had experimented with real LasPlagas instead of the artificial parasites and viruses, what kind of bioweapons would they have created? But that's a topic for another deep dive. Kinda unsettling when you think about it now. Even the researchers themselves had second thoughts about what they had created, because they knew exactly where the Regenerators stood on the food chain. But despite their horrific nature, they weren't actually the most powerful bioweapons Leon faced. They wouldn't stand a chance against a Verdugo or even a Garrador, yet somehow they were still the scariest monsters in the game, if not the entire series. What made them terrifying wasn't their strength, but their unnatural presence. Unlike other bioweapons that had visible weak spots or predictable behaviors, the Regenerator was a blank slate, cold, silent, unreadable. Its only defining feature was that unnerving grin, stretched across a body that was otherwise featureless and inhuman. It wasn't just some failed experiment or mindless beast, it was something that shouldn't exist, and yet it did. Its ability to regenerate indefinitely meant that the only way to replace it was a more advanced version of itself. These were probably early prototypes created with crude technology and limited resources. If Umbrella had refined them, who knows what they could have become. But then that raises an even bigger question. If Regenerators weren't fully controllable and they could adapt to different environments, like the ones in the storage area that became resistant to extreme cold, how long would it take before they evolved beyond their only weakness? What happens when shooting out all their plaga isn't enough to stop them anymore? From a practical standpoint, the Regenerator represents the ultimate nightmare in bioweaponry. A soldier that can withstand almost anything and adapt to new threats over time. But from a philosophical standpoint, it raises a darker question. If something cannot die, does it even have a purpose? The Regenerator isn't a predator, nor is it truly alive. It doesn't hunt, it doesn't eat by choice. It just follows its programming, acting as a perfect vessel for whatever controls it. But what happens when something like this exists without control? When it adapts beyond human understanding? The more you think about it, the more disturbing it becomes. Because at some point, the Regenerator stops being a monster made by man, and starts becoming something that man was never meant to create.